Ezekiel 33:3.
Hello, everyone, and happy Sabbath and happy Feast of Lots, also known as Purim. That's what our topic is for today. This is actually the second day of the Feast of Lots, also known as Purim. It would have started yesterday, and I'm going to walk you through all the logic in regards to what it says in the Bible, how it's practiced, and all those kind of details. So what is Purim? Purim is a celebration of Jewish deliverance, as told in the book of Esther, the Megillah. Purim is a Jewish holiday that commemorates the saving of the Jewish people from Haman, who was planning to kill all the Jews. This took place in the ancient Achaemenid Persian Empire. The story is recorded in the biblical book of Esther, the Megillah. The book of Esther described part of the Jewish diaspora that stayed behind in Persia and did not return to Jerusalem during the restoration. According to the book of Esther, Haman, the royal vizier to King Ahasuerus, presumed to be Xerxes I or Artaxerxes I of Persia, Kirashur or Kishur in Old Persian respectively, planned to kill all the Jews in the empire, but his plans were foiled by Mordecai and his cousin, an adopted daughter Esther, who had risen and become queen of Persia. The day of deliverance became a day of feasting and rejoicing. So basically, the idea of the story, you had Jews who had returned back to Jerusalem. Some Jews did not. Some Jews actually remained in Persia. And we're going to go through that history in a little bit, just so you can see exactly where the book of Esther takes place. But the Jews who didn't go back to Jerusalem, who actually remained in the Persian Empire, this is where that story is taking place. So what happened was there was a leader, or there was a man called Haman, and Haman had basically put out an edict signed by the king at the time to have all the Jews be exterminated. So it was given the impression from the king's ring, which means that it had to be fulfilled. The outcome was when this letter went out, his wife, who was a Jew, Esther, confessed and said that she was Jewish. And so that's how the story of Purim goes from this story of sadness and what looks like it's going to be the complete genocide of a people to all of a sudden things being turned right around. So that's what you see with Purim, this idea of things being turned around. Just be careful, though, because there's been some modern day groups that have completely removed the actual meaning of Purim and changed it into something else. When they've turned it around the sense of sin is okay as opposed to not okay, that kind of an upside down. And so you'll find that there are some small sects within Israel that are practicing Purim in this way, where it literally does look like the Bible backwards. So be very careful with that. That's not what Purim was about. Purim was the backwardsness of the Jews about to be exterminated, and then all of a sudden they became in power. That was the reversal. So Purim is one of the 9 holy days of the Bible. There are 9 holy days. We've studied the 9 holy days before, and there are 7 holy days that are to be kept forever. So I actually wrote the verses beside each one of these holy days, so you can actually correspond with the Bible and see, yes, in fact, you're supposed to keep these holidays forever. Feast of Weeks is discussed in Exodus 23:14-17. You'll read that that was a holy day to be kept forever. Feast of First Fruits, same thing. Day of Atonement shows up in Leviticus 23:26-32. Again, that was a holiday to be kept forever. Feast of Tabernacles, that shows up in Exodus 23:14-17. Same logic applies. Passover, as well as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. There was only one day that was not explicitly said to be kept forever, which was the Feast of Trumpets, but I do believe that is still to be kept forever. It just wasn't specifically written the same way that these other days were. The Feast of Trumpets shows up in the book of Leviticus 23:23, and again, it shows up in the book of Revelation. So the trumpets are actually sounding before Christ comes. So the trumpets in Revelation are actually matching the Feast of Trumpets. So my belief is that this is a holiday that's supposed to be kept till the end of time, since in fact it's marking basically the end of the story. But to be technically accurate, there are 6 days that are explicitly said to be kept forever, and those are the ones above. So you have your major holy days and your minor holy days. Your major holy days all came directly from God himself. Those are the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost, the Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, Feast of Tabernacles, also known as the Feast of Booths or Sukkot. We've also got the minor holy days. Minor holy days are Feast of Dedication. You probably know it as Hanukkah, and the Feast of Lots, which is Purim. So we're looking today at the Feast of Lots or Purim. And if you take a look at that yellow square on the calendar, you'll see it's kind of sitting right at the December mark where, Adar. Adar right between February and March. So right where it says 12th Adar, you'll see that kind of a bluish block. That's where Purim resides in the year. And you can kind of look with the actual calendar that we use today, the Gregorian calendar sitting in the center. You can see that it's very close to the Passover. It's 1 month from the Passover. So right after Adar comes Nisan. Nisan is the beginning of the year, and Nisan is where you would have the Passover. That's the orange block. So there are 5 holy days practiced in the New Testament. Passover, you'll see that one in the 1 Corinthians 5 and 6. Feast of Unleavened Bread, that shows up in Acts 12 and 3. Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost or Shavuot, that's in Acts 2. Here's one that shows up in the book of Revelation, the Feast of Trumpets, 8:11. Now, keep in mind, they're not necessarily practicing the holy day. It's more so the explanation of the holy day revealed. So you're seeing that in Revelation, where this is the reason why you were keeping the Feast of Trumpets. Feast of Dedication, also known as Hanukkah or Festival of Lights, that's John 10 and 22. And Purim does show up in the Bible in the New Testament. Feast of Lots or Purim, it is not named. It's in John 5:1. So the question is, did Jesus celebrate Purim? If we can find it in the New Testament, can we prove whether or not Christ celebrated Purim? If we look in John chapter 1, 5 to 9, it says, after this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there was in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roof colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew he had already been there a long time, he said to him, do you want to be healed? The sick man answered him, sir, I have no one to put me into this pool when I have no one to put me into this pool when the water is stirred up. And while I am going, another steps down before me. Jesus said to him, get up, take your bed and walk. And at once the man was healed. And he took up his bed and walked. Now that was the Sabbath. If you take a look at the very first verse here, so this is John 1:5. After this, there was a feast of the Jews. We don't know what this feast is. But if we use John and we look at earlier parts of John and latter parts of John, we can locate and isolate exactly which feast is being spoken of that is unnamed by John. If you look at the commentaries for John 5:1, you will find the answer. So this is Ellicott's commentary for English readers, and Myers agrees. It says, the time limits are John 4:35, which was Tebeth, January, and John 6:4, which brings us to the Passover in Nisan, April, i.e. an interval of 4 months, the year being intercalary one with the month of Vidar and Adar, added, or as we should say, with 2 months of March. Here it is. The only feast which falls in this interval is the Feast of Purim. And it is with this that the best modern opinion identifies the feast of our text. So John 5:1, the feast of the text, you have to understand that later in John, you see in John 6:4, we see the Passover. Earlier in John, we can see that we're in Tebeth. So then we can locate that. What sits between Passover and Tebeth would be the only holiday left is Purim. It was kept on the 14th of Adar, which is March, in commemoration of the deliverance of the Jews from the plots of Haman, and took its name from the lots cast by him. So it's called the Feast of Lots or Purim. So lot is like when you're drawing a straw. If you draw the short end of the straw, you've drawn the lot. So Esther 3:7, you'll see where the name lots comes into play, and Esther 9:24. It was one of the most popular feasts and was characterized by festive rejoicings, presents, and gifts to the poor. If you want to find more information about Purim, you can read the book called The Antiquities of the Jews by Josephus. Josephus writes more about Purim. At the same time, it was not one of the great feasts. And while the writer names the Passover in John 2:13 and John 6:4 and John 13:1, the Feast of Tabernacles in John 7:2, and even that of the Feast of Dedication in John 10:22, this has no further importance in the narrative than the account for the fact that Jesus being again in Jerusalem. So when we look at the great feasts or the major holy days, this isn't one of the major holy days, but we do see that Christ did participate in one of the lesser holidays, the minor holy days, because we know in the book of John 10:22, he was there for Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication, the Festival of Lights. We don't see, though, John actually taking Purim and giving Purim a name. So for whatever reason, John just decided that the festival wasn't important enough that he was going to actually name it, but he did describe it as we just seen. Where in the Bible do we find Purim? So we already know it's the book of Esther, but let's get a little bit more specific. The fifth of the five Megilliot. When you hear the word Megilliot, Megilliot means scrolls. You have to remember that what we have today, books, the word Bible comes from the word biblios. Biblios, we're looking around Phoenicia. Biblios is where you get the word Bible and book. It was the first book. Biblios is where the first books were made. So these weren't books. You have to remember that this was before we had written books. We had scrolls at this time that were written on parchment or animal skins. And so this was called the fifth of the Megilliot, meaning the fifth of the scrolls. So first scroll was called the Song of Songs. Second was called Ruth. Third was Lamentations. Fourth is Ecclesiastes. And then fifth is Esther. And then you can see the Hebrew spelling on the right-hand side. So Esther is part of the Old Testament. So that's the 39 books of the Old Testament. That's, of course, if we're looking at the Protestant Bible. Of course, with Catholics, it's a little bit different in the Vulgate. So 39 books of the Old Testament, we'll find the book of Esther in there. And then, of course, our New Testament is the other 27 books, making a total of 66. The 39 books of the Old Testament, of course, if we're looking at this from the eyes of an Israelite or from a Jew, they'll look at the Tanakh, which is the Old Testament. It's 24 books, not 39 books. It contains the same books as the 39 in the Old Testament, except some of the books are actually merged together, which is why there's less books. Same content, but some books are actually grouped together as one book. So it's broken down into three chunks. The Torah, or the Tanakh, is broken into the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. So the Torah are the first 5 books. The Nevi'im are the book of the prophets. There's 12 minor prophets, and they're composed in 8 books. So you get 7 major prophets and 12 minor prophets in the book of the prophets. And then the Ketuvim, that's 11 books. Those 11 books, this is where we're getting Esther from. We've got the poetic books, the 5 scrolls, and the other books. So Esther exists within the 5 scrolls, or the 5 Megilliot. And so, of course, as you remember, the word Tanakh, which is Old Testament, if we're talking to someone speaking Hebrew, Tanakh is TNK, which stands for Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. So it's the breakdown of the 3 sections of the Bible. So we're going to be focusing today on the Ketuvim, and specifically on the 5th scroll of the Megilliot, which is the book of Esther. So with our 39 books of the Old Testament, the first 5, we said that was the Torah. It's also called the Pentateuch, or the 5 books of Moses. And on the right, you can see the names translated into Hebrew. Nevi'im, the book of the prophets. There were 7 major prophets. Those 7 major prophets were Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. 12 minor prophets: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And then our focus for today, we're looking at the Ketuvim. Ketuvim is called the writings, and we're looking specifically at the Hamesh Megilliot, or the 5 scrolls, and we're looking at the last scroll, and the last scroll is the book of Esther. Esther 9, 20, and 22. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to all the Jews in all the provinces of King Xerxes, both near and far, to establish among them an annual celebration on the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the days on which the Jews had rid themselves of their enemies, and the month of which their sorrow had turned to joy and their mourning into a holiday. That's the reversal. This is where you're seeing the reversing right here. He wrote that these were to be days of feasting and joy, of sending gifts to one another and to the poor. So if you take a look here, you can see this is not actually a holiday coming from God. This is a holiday that the people had created themselves. That's why it's not a major holiday. It's a minor holiday. The books of Esther and the Song of Songs are the only books in the Bible that do not mention God at all. There's no mention of Elohim. There's no mention of the Lord. It's just no presence. So in this case, what we're seeing is we're seeing God work through people. What are some of the major events that occurred before Purim? So just so we can get our heads into an alignment as to what has already happened in the story before we have Purim, I'm going to walk you forward from basically the times of Moses to Purim so you can see exactly how everything fits together. So if we were to talk about let my people go, when we had the Exodus out of Egypt, this is around 1500 BC. We believe the Pharaoh of Egypt was Thutmose III. Thutmose III, he was recorded as having boils on his skin, which would match the 6th plague of Exodus. And obviously, when we took a look into who reigned after him, there was no heir. So it looks quite likely that Thutmose III would be our Exodus pharaoh from Egypt. So 1500 BC, let my people go. Then we have the Exodus from Egypt, and this was the route that they took. And you can see here, they went down through Shur, and then all the way to the wilderness of Sin, and then past Dopka, and then to Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai should ring a bell because that's, of course, where they grabbed the 10 Commandments. Moses went up on the mountain. He grabbed the 10 Commandments. Remember, he smashed them, got a second set. We'll still keep this around 1500 BC because, of course, this is all part of the Exodus. Then we have wandering in the wilderness. We know that the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. It wasn't because they were lost. It wasn't because there was some kind of a mountain or some obstacle that they had to climb through in the wilderness. The reason why they were wandering in the wilderness for 40 years is because God wanted the older generation to pass away so the newer generation wouldn't bring all the customs of the Egyptians into the promised land. So since the older generation was very akin to the customs and rituals and traditions and practices of Egypt, God decided to separate them. So what he did was he allowed 40 years to pass, and so no one was left of the previous generation who could continue the false worship that was going on in Egypt. So only the young were to survive. From the wilderness to Kadesh Barnea. So from Mount Sinai, this was their path that they took. This was over the span of 40 years traveling until they finally reached Kadesh Barnea. This is where we start to see the conquests of Joshua and the book of Joshua. So first we see the route of the spies. So from Kadesh Barnea, we see that Joshua sends spies into the land of Canaan. Remember, there's people already in Canaan. So they're basically scoping it out. They're doing some recon. They're trying to see, what does the territory look like? What's the land like? Where's the water? Where's the food? And then obviously, who's living here? What are the enemies like? So then there's a series of conquests that happen. So after the spies go into Canaan and then see the people there, we see these conquests, and that's pretty much the entire book of Joshua. And on the left-hand side, sorry, you can see that there was a central, a southern, and a northern campaign. Following the conquest, keep in mind, after they had conquered the people living in that area, they then had taken the area for themselves. So each one of the tribes of Israel, there were 12, they were all given an inheritance of a piece of land which they had conquered during the times of Joshua's conquest. So if you take a look on the left and you take a look on the right, you'll see these were the lands of the Canaanites, which then became the land of Israel. So this was the promised land. If you're wondering, why did God have Joshua go through Canaan and conquer and take all this land if the Canaanites were there first? You'd have to read the Deuterocanonical books to understand why the promised land is the promised land. Yes, the promised land was promised to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the book of Genesis. However, if you read books such as the book of Jasher or the book of Jubilees, you'll find that there's extra details. You'll find that before, Noah's sons, Japheth, Ham, and Shem, had went to a well called Beersheba, which is typically a well of oaths where a lot of oaths were taken. At this well, they had sworn that they would not go into each other's land. The land of Canaan was supposed to be occupied by Shem. The land of Ham was supposed to be Africa. And the land of Japheth was supposed to be what you would call Europe and Asia today. Obviously, not all of the Hamites stayed in Africa because, of course, Canaan was a child of Ham. So some of the children of Ham actually went into the land of Shem, which is why they were breaching the rules of the promised land. Solomon's Temple, 957 BC. So this is another major landmark. So after the land's divided, we have all the land divided. And one thing I'll point out here on this last piece, you'll notice that only one tribe is missing. You will find every single tribe listed here except for one. The tribe that you will not find is the Levites. The Levites did not get a piece of land. If you read the book of Numbers, you'll find that the priests had to work inside the temple, which is why they had no land. And this should also explain why churches pay tithes, or at least why back in the day they used to pay tithes. Tithes, or 1/10, was supposed to be given to the Levites because the Levites were working in the temple. They had no land of their own. They had no way to take care of themselves. The surrounding brothers would give 1/10, or a tithe of all they owned, to the Levites. And so this is where you get the idea of a tithe from. It's a tenth. It's a tenth of your earnings, and it supports the priests who had no way to basically find a means to live because they were busy doing the temple sacrifices on behalf of all the other brothers. Later in time, we have Solomon's Temple, approximately 957 BC. So this was the first Jewish temple. So this is built on the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is obviously under dispute today. It's now in the control of Islam, and Jews are not allowed to pray there, but they are allowed to visit there. So the Temple Mount, originally Solomon's temple, this is where they had taken the tabernacle, the moving tabernacle, the set of tents that they had in the wilderness. The tent, which was the main tent where you would see the holy place, the most holy place where God would reside, that now became Solomon's temple, the stationary temple, which was no longer a tent. Following this, we had a captivity. So the North Kingdom and the South Kingdom ended up splitting. We've studied that in previous Sabbath studies. When the North and South Kingdom split, the South was called Judah, the North was called Israel. The Northern Kingdom was taken captive. They were first warned by a prophet to stop worshiping foreign gods. When they continued to worship the gods of Egypt and they would not stop, they were taken captive by the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians took them into areas such as Nineveh and Calva and all the way almost into Media. This was in 734 BC. After this captivity, the Northern Kingdom never really came back. Some of them did trickle into Judah, but for the most part, what happened was, you'll read later in the Bible, that the Assyrians actually tried to replace the Northern Kingdom with the Samaritans. Then there was a second captivity a couple hundred years later. This was the captivity in Babylon. This was when the Southern Kingdom of Judah was now taken captive. Now we have both the Southern and Northern Kingdom that have been taken captive in history. So there were two captivities. This is very important that you remember this. So the second captivity was the captivity in Babylon. And then what happened was the Jews were living in Babylon up until the point of 539 BC, when the Edict of King Cyrus was passed. So this was created in 6 BC and was discovered in the ruins of Babylon and Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, in 1879. This seal is what confirms the fact that there was a Persian king that allowed the Jews to go back to their homeland in Jerusalem, and it was proof outside of the Bible. In the Bible, in the book of Ezra, you read in Ezra 1:1-3, it says, "In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and also put it in writing. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem and Judah. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem and Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem, and who may be with them." So we have biblical proof that King Cyrus sent the Jews back to Jerusalem. But obviously, up until this point in the 1800s, we had no way to prove it outside of the Bible. When they found the seal of King Cyrus, this crushed the conversation, because scholars could not make the comment anymore that it was highly unlikely that a Persian king would give such power to another group of people. It was just very unlikely in that period of time in the world. It never happened before. But this was obviously proof of it. So we had the return to Jerusalem. So after we had this edict from King Cyrus, we had everyone go back to Jerusalem, and this was the route that they took. As a matter of fact, in 2019, I believe, it was either 2019 or 2020, I believe it was 2019. 2019, Donald Trump was actually compared to King Cyrus, and coins were manufactured in Israel with King Cyrus and Donald Trump on the coin. And the reason why was because he moved the embassy, the US embassy, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And the idea was, by moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, that would be one step closer to having Jerusalem being recognized as not a part of Islam in regards to the areas that Islam is controlling, but instead, again, come under the Jewish control. So right now, it was around the 12th century, we had the Crusades, and it was Islam actually that conquered that Temple Mount area and has been holding it ever since. So these moves that have been going on in the last couple of years here, it looks like what's going on is the Jews are trying to kind of take control over the Temple Mount area again, and it looks like Donald Trump was trying to help with that. But again, this was the reason why Trump was being compared to King Cyrus. So the Jews returned back to Jerusalem. But not everyone returned back to Jerusalem from Persia. Some Jews actually stayed behind. And this is where we start the story recorded in the book of Esther. The book of Esther is actually talking about the Jews that did not go back to Jerusalem. These were the Jews that were taken into captivity in Babylon. And then after Persia conquered Babylon, these Jews stayed there. And so now we're going to take a look at the book of Esther. So we're going to start with our annual reading of the book of Esther. Typically what happens every year, if you would go to a synagogue or you're living in Israel and you're celebrating with family, one of the traditions of the book of Esther is that they actually read the entire book of Esther every year. Yeah.
For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of the dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Brothers and sisters, the sword is coming. If you hear the watchman's call, please repent and seek out Jesus Christ. There is still time. That at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow.